Great. Thank you everyone for joining today on this webinar in the My World 2030 Asia Pacific Advocacy Program. Today is the second webinar on the theme of youth and volunteering engagement for the SDGs, looking at Asia Pacific trends. And we have a wonderful speaker today, Ms. Emilia Asadova. She's been working for UNV Asia Pacific, UN Volunteers Asia Pacific Office, for quite a few years now, and you really have a top expert on volunteerism in the room today. So I'm sure you will benefit a lot from her expertise and from her knowledge about volunteerism in the region. We also have Suki, that you can see in the screen right now. Suki is my colleague from the UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub. She's supporting also the implementation of the My World 2030 program. In the room today, we also have Jessica and Senki, and they are also both of them working in the UNV Asia Pacific office. Hi guys, thank you so much for helping preparing this presentation and for your support to this program. And I believe we also have our colleague Jirawat from the UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub, who's helping us with IT today, so thank you to you as well. So we have about 25 participants, and I think it's a good time to start. I will give the floor to Emilia, who will do a presentation in 2 times. It would be, I think, about 12 slides to start with. Then there will be a break and a chance to ask questions. In the meantime, please use the comments box on the right-hand side to ask your questions. Make sure you ask questions about the topic of the webinar. So anything related to volunteerism, youth engagement, the SDGs, and this region will be accepted today. All the questions related to the program, the partner ID, social media impact, those will be either addressed in the Facebook group in the meantime or during the upcoming webinars. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Emilia, for taking the time to be with us today. And I'm handing over the floor to you. Thank you so much, and enjoy, everyone.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, good morning, because I guess we are slightly in different time zones. It's a pleasure for me to be here and sharing with you a bit of my knowledge from what I know. I did mention last time that I also started some years ago as a volunteer myself. I did have a youth network, and I did work with a lot of my friends and peers to also promote the Millennium Development Goals. So I hope that today I will be able to give you some of the background to understand a bit more the Sustainable Development Goals, how youth and volunteers can engage and are already engaged, what are some global regional mechanisms that are in place so that you are aware, as well as something that you should be aware of when you work in your countries or the partnerships that you try to establish with your projects. So feel free to ask questions after I go through around 12 slides. So I would like to first start with a video. I don't know how many of you, maybe you have seen the video. It's a video about the Sustainable Development Goals and the principle of leaving no one behind. So we'll watch a video and then I will continue.
Is it working?
No, you need to press play somewhere on the slide.
Yeah, I tried just now. Yeah. It works just now. Oh,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Yes. Is it full screen? Okay. Is it? No, I think they cannot see it.
Oh. What is it?
It's loading.
So slow.
Oh.
Oh.
No. Is it? Or is it better to share the slides from Nadine's side?
I was refugee in Pakistan, I was refugee in Iran, I was refugee in Dubai, and now I'm a refugee in France.
Les gens, quand tu es handicapé, ils n'essaient même pas de voir ce que tu es capable de faire, mais ils te jugent à travers ton handicap.
Haberme venido no fue una buena idea.
यहाँ की लड़कियां कुछ नहीं कर सकती।
लाइट रहे, जियार रहे, हमरो बाल बचाओ जियार रहे.
Agora me fumidam bem, só para mim, bem, mas que ele não me roda.
Porque se todo mundo tivesse alimento em casa, ela podia raciocinar. Então, poderia ser pobre, mas teria a inteligência na cabeça para poder sair dali.
Parce que na mukil mutu azwana mission na onza matindelai. Ngape na za mukil pona mission na ngai me nzambe ndayebi.
I've left my husband to be with a woman, and for me that's a huge step in my country as an African woman to do that. I do have a strong voice and I'm strong as a woman speaking for myself.
Nous devons dire au monde que nous existons, que vous êtes là. Et je suis sûr qu'aucune misère, aucune pauvreté extrême n'est pas une fatalité. On peut la combattre.
Okay, so I hope you really like the video like I do. It's one of our favorite videos, at least among the colleagues in UNV, because it shows a different side to the colorful pictures, the goals, the sustainable development goals. It actually goes a bit deeper to explain principle of leaving no one behind. So what you will see in the video, you saw different groups that are left behind. Actually, you saw a lesbian woman, you saw refugee, you saw a person that a poor person probably that cannot afford proper education. He talks about his son that will have a different life because he had education. You had another person who said, should I have had education, my life would be different. So the whole principle behind the Sustainable Development Goals, which is very different from the previous, the Millennium Development Goals, is actually this principle of leaving no one behind and the focus of achieving all these goals for these groups that are usually excluded from the development or etc. And the other principle of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is not shown in this video, is actually universality of these goals and the interconnectedness. It's actually quite important because we try to, whenever we try to explain to people, we also engage in some discussions with colleagues here. There are lots of analysis and a lot of literature, and I will be happy to share links if you would like, that every goal is almost connected to at least 5 or 6 or more goals. So for example, if there will be no poverty, then you will have access to education, better education and health. Or if there are reduced inequalities or reduced gender inequality, for example, and for example, if young girls or young women will have more opportunities, that leads to achievement of the certain other different targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's one. So now we will talk about the moving back to volunteerism as a way to actually to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And you guys are already doing it. You are part of a lot of be it formal or informal networks, organizations, NGOs. So you are already volunteering or acting on these goals, be it on each one of it or as a separate or the interconnected one. But I think a message for you to take from me on this point is that even if your focus of your initiatives are only on education, you should probably try to also think and challenge a bit yourself on how you actually, through what you do on, let's say, girls' education, you actually contribute to some of the other goals. So I already mentioned in my last presentation about volunteerism, so I will not repeat it, but I think the definition is for you guys to really take in mind when you work with volunteers or when you hear someone mention the word. So I will leave it here as a complete sort of presentation on everything on volunteerism. And because I represent the organization of UN Volunteers, where we do promote volunteerism or the proper use of volunteerism and volunteers, because we get in a lot of well, volunteerism has a lot of gray areas, or could have a lot of gray areas, because you could have the forced labor as also sometimes could be presented as volunteering. So that's why it's important that volunteering is not forced, but it's done out of free will. So I just remain the slide. So you already know that volunteers can and already play a key role in sustainable development, be it first respondents, or they broaden participation of the excluded groups, for example, on the development issues, or when it comes to leave no one behind, they will also be the first ones to actually help. So I don't need to go, you already are knowing and doing this. I kept the slides for those of you who were in the first webinar where we did a bit of introduction. I talked about some of the ways to achieve the SDGs. So I'm not going to go over this because I'm sure you guys can add 20 more different ideas on the ways to achieve SDGs through the amazing work you are doing. But I will just keep it for the record. I also talked about this, youth volunteering. Actually, from my point, I used to, because my work is largely related to working with young people for more than 10 years. And I was a youth specialist before in UNV, before I started this other role last year. Actually, right now, you guys, the population of youth is the most educated population in the last 65 years. So there's a lot of hope and a lot of ambition. So if you would compare yourselves to young people in 1960s, you know, their level, the level globally was 42%, whereas now the education level and the literacy level of young people is 86%. So believe in yourself and believe in what you do. And so now we move to why volunteerism is important. We did a small desk study and a few of the interviews with volunteers from this region, where we try to really understand why volunteerism is important and what does it bring to the volunteers that are involved. So you will see that there are obviously, and a lot of you that have done volunteering or are doing it, you will know that it's a social resources. It's the most valuable networks that you could get. I work in UN for more than 13 years, and I could not say how important are the networks wherever you go. So I really think and believe the volunteering could really help you get these networks. And I think for the ASEAN My World and for your projects and initiatives, this is also quite important. And also the human capital that you bring, the skills, there is a lot of talk and debate right now, and a lot of you probably heard about the future of work and how a lot of the machines or artificial intelligence will be taking away some of these jobs. But guess what? The empathy or the soft skills or the teamwork, or leadership, this is something that you could actually develop as a skill through volunteerism. And this is something that could bring you even, when the machines start to control our lives more. So just to give you a little bit on what is happening on volunteering in the region, you probably did not know, and I would be happy if you knew that. UNV recently did a State of the World Volunteerism report, where we estimated the number of volunteers in the world, which is 109 million. So in the region of Asia Pacific, where I work, it's 28.7%, and you will see compared to only Europe and Central Asia, which is a little bit larger, but otherwise our region and you guys, we are one of the big part of the volunteering equation. So our efforts are very important. If we look also at the distinct characteristic, or what we call formal and informal volunteering, I will explain here the informal volunteering, which is 60% of the volunteering that takes place in the region. It means that if you are volunteering through not through an organization, this is informal volunteering. If something happened in your community and you went and volunteered, or if you have a network with your peers, or you started some kind of a self-help group, or whatever you want to call it, you are informal volunteers. And this is 60% of population of all the volunteers in the region, whereas 40% are still doing it through organizations. So some of the governments in this region, for example, in India, in Nepal, there are some of the schemes or volunteer schemes, so-called, through which people can volunteer. There are other organizations, like international organizations, like Volunteer Services Overseas, VSO, or ICRC, through where also young people or people volunteer. And there are numerous local ones as well that I'm sure you will know. Also universities have some of these. Also, if you look at the gender dimension on the slide, it actually shows that women do most of the volunteering according to the estimates that we that UNV had, and especially of the informal volunteering. So moving forward, oh, actually this is a global estimate, and I shouldn't have included it, but I guess yeah. I think, okay, so we are moving next. So here I will talk about a little bit on where volunteerism sits with regards to the SDGs and other sort of processes that are happening on the development. So since actually this arrow that you see does not show, but since 1968, there were 20 resolutions, the General Assembly resolutions on the subject of volunteerism. So for example, in 1985, the December 5th, which is the International Volunteer Day for Economic and Social Development, was established. And there are the resolutions that establish the International Year of Volunteering and so on. So this is just to say that volunteering existed and still exists up to now. So the important thing that where volunteering has started or integrated into the Sustainable Development Goals actually happened in 2012, when the resolution came on integrating volunteering in the next decade, and the next one on integrating volunteering in peace and development. You see the writing in red, the plan of action for the next decade and beyond. This is a very important resolution, because I will explain to you in 2 slides on what are the objectives to actually try to align and bring more the value of volunteerism to the sustainable development in the larger development discourse. So here I also show these are the resolutions on the plan of action, and the most recent one that actually was adopted last year in 2018, but that was in December, volunteering for the 2030 agenda. This resolution is very important because it does give a stronger impetus to volunteerism and the role that volunteers can play, because all the member states that adopted the resolution have actually acknowledged that the role of volunteers as accelerators for the development agenda should be strengthened. They made a commitment to actually try to integrate volunteers more in the development or national development plans and etc. And most importantly, next year, there will be a global technical meeting on volunteerism where sort of stock taking or review of the evidence of how actually does volunteerism helps implementation of SDGs or supports the Sustainable Development Goals will be reviewed. So I will just like to focus on the plan of action, and then we can take probably questions if there are. So this is the resolution that I mentioned that was adopted in 2012, which is called the plan of action. And these are the 3 key objectives. The strengthening ownership of the development agenda. So by this objective, what we actually mean is that for advocates or for volunteers or for whatever you call, and if you're doing something for the good or for achievement of the SDGs, that actually this ownership of the development agenda, there are mechanisms for you to do that. So this is one objective, and this is not to say that it is something that UNV will try. It's something that we as a UNV try to support, but this is also some of the commitment that your countries have also taken to say that we will provide, we will give more ownership to people of the development. The second objective is to integrate volunteers into national and global implementation strategies for the development agenda. So this is quite important because you will see, I will talk about this later in my presentations. There are a few mechanisms of engagement into the national development processes. And I think it's important for you guys to know when you try to advocate for SDGs or one of the SDGs to actually be able to use those mechanisms for you to play. And then the third one is to actually measure volunteers to contribute to the understanding of the engagement. So as of now, there is only one sort of globally recognized methodology to measure volunteerism, which is the International Labour Organization, which is part of the UN family. They have a very thick, big book that is called Measurement of Volunteer Work. And this is the only sort of universally agreed methodology by all the member states. But this has to be done as part of the National Labor Service that a lot of countries are doing. So this process is very cumbersome because it takes a lot of people resources in the countries and costs a lot of money to the government. So here we are, we are trying to think about and propose some other ways of how can we actually measure volunteerism? How can we actually show to a lot of people who still need to be convinced about the value of volunteers? So we are actually looking at a lot of best practices and evidence from many of the countries in this region, but also globally on, for example, measuring the social value of volunteers, because one thing is to monetize, somehow calculate the economic contribution of volunteers, but another way is also to look at the social aspect, which is you cannot measure the social trust in the communities, or you cannot measure that someone became happier, you know. So these things are something that we are working right now. But I think for you also quite important to keep in mind when you work with volunteers and you also try to think what is the value that volunteers bring in my initiative or could bring. So I will pause here if we have any questions, and then I will continue.
So our advocates can unmute themselves. I didn't say. Yeah. So if you have a question, you can both send to the chat or unmute yourself.
Yeah, so if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the text box and I'll take it.
So the best way is actually to raise your hand. That's where we can see you, and then instead of interrupting someone speaking, then you can go. While people prepare their questions, I have one for you, Emilia. If you can tell us from your work experience, what are the countries in this region that are a bit more favorable to volunteerism? Are there champions within this region? I'm thinking maybe Bangladesh or India, Sri Lanka. Can you tell us more about the kind of work, their plan of action in maybe the top 3 countries in the region?
Okay, well, we actually did a regional overview or a regional analysis of volunteerism in the region, and we presented it in March to countries from this region, to member states and NGO partners. And actually, I mean, there are different levels, or I mean, if you would be for me to select the criteria, there are some countries in this region that have good policies on volunteerism, but there are others that, for example, Philippines has a separate policy on volunteerism. Singapore has a separate policy on volunteerism. Other countries have volunteerism integrated as part of the youth policies. So, for example, India has volunteerism that is integrated in the National Development Plan. So this is also, you know, different opportunities that I think are there for volunteerism to thrive in the countries. I think in terms of the mechanism through, or organizations through which people can volunteer, I mean, I was just in India a couple of weeks ago, and I was impressed. We had a big conference, and we invited a lot of the government and NGOs and volunteer organizations, and I was impressed at the scale the culture of volunteerism in India, but of course there are, I think the context of the country also is very significant, and I know in the country like India and in many other countries in the region, it is vitally important to actually work alongside or partner with volunteers and communities, because there is no other way to reach out to the remotest districts, and even to let them know that there is a government immunization program, or there is this education program, etc. I think in Bangladesh, actually, because you mentioned, Nadine, Bangladesh has a lot of the volunteer involving organizations, what we call. These are, and different other groups. So the culture of volunteerism, I think, is very low. So it's very difficult for me to pick the three sort of champions. If you would to ask me about Thailand, I could say that Thailand has also quite a lot to support volunteers. They have a policy, they have the National Volunteer Day even, they have different schemes through which volunteers can get involved. So it's a difficult question. I think countries excel in different ways when it comes to volunteering.
I think there's a question from our advocate.
Okay, I have, there is a question from Arzu. What are the challenges you have faced in the past with such programs in terms of volunteer engagement in specific regions, and how is the engagement measured? What are the challenges in the past with such programs? With which programs? I mean, with volunteer programs, or
volunteer engagement.
Okay, so from the way how we understand the question is, I guess the question is more on what are the challenges in terms of volunteer engagement programs that I worked with, and how is the engagement measured? So, of course, the programs or volunteer programs that UNV supports is with a lot of the governments and or the NGO partners that we do. It's because of our mandate as the UN entity to support the UN member states. So, of course, this does not, the experience that we have, that UNV has, could not be said that this is the only way, or this is the only right answer to this question, because you could learn probably a lot from the volunteer group in each of your countries that are doing a lot. But from my experience and my perspective, the challenges is always volunteer retention. So how can you actually, once you get a group of volunteers, that you will start engaging, let's say in your campaign or in your trainings or community work, is how can you make sure that they will stay with you until the end of your initiative. So this is one. The next one would be, for example, the recognition of volunteers, which is also linked to that, or the management of volunteers. So, and a lot of this is interlinked, is if you design an initiative where you will recognize the volunteers, which is something that we do with the volunteers that we work with, be it online or physical, we would always have, it's either an award on a yearly basis that exists actually in many countries, or it's a recognition or some sort of a certificate that you would give at the end of someone's volunteer experience, or it should be actually be stated clearly in terms of the retention when you work with volunteers, that you are expected to to sort of commit and ask if volunteers could commit for, I don't know, 1 month, for example, because our initiative is for 1 month, and then to sort of get this commitment of the volunteer. I mean, volunteers, everyone is a human being, so things happen. So when we work with volunteers, we actually try to get more volunteers, so to back up each other or work together on a few issues in the countries, be it advocacy or someone working on budget or etc. So that if one volunteer would actually, decide to leave, then there would be a second sort of backup. We tried different ways of actually setting a volunteer coordinator, a person who would constantly on a day-to-day basis in some of our programs interact with volunteers and assess, like, how are you feeling? Are you enjoying what you're doing? So I think it's important, and not just to think that I got a free team member and someone is, but it's always important to build that relationship. I mean, I could go more, but I think these are the three most common issues: is the management, retention, recognition of volunteers. And how the engagement is measured is, I think you could set up criterias for yourself. Some of the programs have set the criterias of engagement as the number of volunteers that you engage. That's like a very simple one. Some of the numbers actually will have the number of the growth of volunteers. For example, like, let's say our baseline was we had 5 volunteers, and the growth should be, I don't know, 200 volunteers at the end of our campaign. Some will also go into, say, how many of the community volunteers have you mobilized, have one volunteer, like, let's say if I'm a volunteer and I have to work in one community on an issue, I will, sort of spread and train, so to say, 5 other volunteers, and that's another metric that you could use. But if you're interested, I have some examples of these types of measurements as well.
I can add something a little bit here. So, for example, for our program, this one, we have the measurement of the number of votes you collected. That's also one of the measurement way. So for each advocate for online, maybe you have to at least 100 votes collected, and for few advocates at least 500 votes collected. So that's also a kind of measurement.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question from Vista, from Philippines. Okay. We had Asad Mustafa. How holistic is the data of International Labour Organization for measurement of volunteers? Are there any limitations in their way of measuring? Okay, that's a very, very good question. And it's a question where we could dedicate a whole webinar, maybe more, actually, because the methodology, or the book, the thick book that I mentioned, the International Labour Organization's measurement of volunteer work, is it is very holistic. It is holistic in a way, but if you would be to ask my sort of opinion, but it only measures part of what is really happening on volunteers with in the region, because a lot of the and I will say why. I will explain why it's not, in my mind, it's not a full picture, is because the ILO methodology only will measure the volunteer work that is counted by the labor statistics or the ministries of labor, which will not count all the informal volunteers. And as I already mentioned, a lot of the volunteerism happens informally. So you have large numbers of people, of volunteers that are not counted in this methodology. And also another limitation is that although the ILO methodology is preferred by a lot of the governments, it is an expensive exercise, And a lot of the countries, what they do is they will add only 1 or 2 questions to their labor survey. So the question would be, for example, one of the questions could be, how many hours in the last month or in the last 2 weeks have you volunteered? And then they will, you know, ask, as in the labor surveys, they will ask, you know, a certain percentage of the population from which they will derive the number of people that volunteer certain hours, etc. If you are interested to actually find out more about this, I'm happy to, Jessica, can you make a note? Mm-hmm. I can share the links on this with you on the ILO methodology as well. But the big question is actually, and another limitation is that it doesn't measure, as I told, the social value that volunteerism brings. So for example, the impact that volunteers make in the community is not whatsoever considered. A lot of this side or the SDG part is not considered there. Okay, I will take the last question. What are some of the best motivators for volunteers to continue and finish a program based on your experience? Okay, so this is a good question. Another good question, I think it depends, of course, on the country and the context. And when I worked with a large number of volunteers before myself, because I needed to have a large group because I was doing a lot of projects and different streams. So I think some of the tricks I used at that time are not relevant anymore, because this was more than 10 years back. So I think I will give you probably the top, what is this? Okay. Some of the best motivators for young people, I think just like think creatively what could motivate a peer like yours. I think a lot of young people that I meet are really keen on getting a certificate. So some people that I meet are very keen to get that. Other groups that we work with, they actually they're interested to get a recommendation letter. So they will ask, you know, an organizer or a coordinator to write a recommendation letter, because this can be used for them in the, you know, in their future career. And actually, we did a small study, and we plan to have a bigger one in Cambodia, where we have a big project on volunteerism with the Ministry of Youth Education and Sports, where we actually went and asked the companies on who they would hire, you know, when they look at the resumes, and majority of them said that if a person has a volunteer experience, they would prefer to actually hire that person, because it means that this person will probably have team working skills. This person will know, will have done something good. So a lot of other reasons, but this is something interesting. I think some other motivators that I see that are popular are also like a group in the Philippines, actually, that I know. They will post like a member of the month, or, you know, a volunteer of the month, and they will write every month, select someone, and will say why, you know, why this volunteer is so special for this month, because he or she has done this. So I think for some young people, social media and this recognition and the fact that a lot of the friends will see them is quite important as well. So just be creative, and I think try different things. Okay, I will continue with my presentation, I guess. I see there are some more. Okay, yeah. I will continue. Okay. Okay, so I will continue with the presentation. We can take more questions afterward at the end. Okay, what am I doing? Okay. So, so now what we have talked about the plan of action as a sort of as a global UN resolution or an agreement of member states to really give this impetus to volunteerism. So volunteers are now an official stakeholder to the sustainable development goals and in the agenda, and they are officially recognized. And for every stakeholder group that is recognized in the SDG agenda, there will be a dedicated global group. Like maybe some of you have heard, there is a major group for children and youth. This is a group that operates globally. They're based in New York, but they have some representatives in the regions around the world that is there to actually represent the interests or the voices of young people when it comes to certain processes that happen in the UN or in the Sustainable Development Goals. So another group that is out there, and a lot of people, a lot of even organizations that I work with, they are not aware of the existence of this group, which is called the Volunteer Groups Alliance. So as you can notice from the name, it's the organization that represents the interests of volunteers. So there are what you see on the slide. These are the sort of the four main aims or the priority action areas where the Volunteer Groups Alliance will act. And this group consists of different organizations, from the volunteer organizations, and actually right now there is, if your organization is a volunteer organization and you would like to be somehow involved in this alliance, please let me know, so we could try to help you become part of the alliance, because there is a big the issue that we see is that a lot of these groups and a lot of these alliances are actually gathered from the organizations from the so-called North. So these organizations that have existed for a long time, they are based somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the US or Canada, that will have this role, and unfortunately not enough organizations from the South, so from countries like your countries, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from India, and etc., that are part of these groups. And as you would see, the aims of this Volunteer Groups Alliance is very aligned to the Plan of Action goals, is to recognize contribution of volunteering, ensure that volunteer groups are recognized, showcase sort of which member states are more supportive, and sort of use it to promote or to lobby with other member states, and also engage the non-governmental actors, and also ensure that the Sustainable Development Goals or any national frameworks on the Sustainable Development Goals actually have a community involvement or a consultation at all levels. And this is important for you to know, I think the last bit especially, because when you will work with in your countries or with your communities, you have to keep this in mind, that there is this commitment and there is this sort of opportunity for you to go to the local government or go to the national government and propose this perhaps as an idea to have a community consultation on, let's say, an education program or this immunization program or etc. So what this Volunteer Groups Alliance does is actually they represent the volunteer organizations, but they will also be next year. As I said, there will be a global meeting on volunteerism, and you see there is a big name for reimagining volunteering for the 2030 agenda. This group will be involved. UNV is a secretariat for the resolution on the plan of action, and of course we will be facilitating a lot of this work. So you will see this is just for your information. This is happening next year. We are working hard as a result of this global technical meeting. We plan to have a pledge by the member states and partners that will signal about the commitment of, you know, decision makers and partners to really promote volunteering for development. And the 4 areas that you see in red is actually where UNV, with a large group of partners from around the world, including from this region, are working hard to get a lot of the evidence and a lot of this research and information that can be presented next year in July to actually say, you know, when we talk about volunteering for SDGs, why is it important, and, you know, what are some of the successful case studies, and where they can be accelerators, and what do governments and partners need to do to support this volunteering environment in the countries. So now the next slide is actually to show on the review processes of the Sustainable Development Goals that are happening in the Asia-Pacific region. So I already mentioned the voluntary national reviews. Oh no, I don't think I mentioned the voluntary national reviews. So according to the resolution that set up the Sustainable Development Goals, the member states have agreed that they will do review of the implementation and the review of the Sustainable Development Goals basically in their countries, and they will call, you know, for the review framework and etc. So one of such processes at the national level is that the countries will produce the voluntary national review report. And this should be led by the country, it's voluntarily, and it should really use the principles of universality and etc. Interrelation of the 17 development goals. And the national SDG progress report, some countries call it like this. What happens at the regional level then, once these countries, every year the countries will be different. So some countries will step up 1 year, and the other countries will take turn next year to actually do this analysis. And countries do it to actually review where they are, what needs to be done, where are the gaps in terms of achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then these countries will then present at the regional level, or they will have series of workshops that a lot of partners from the UN, for example, will support, and they will present at the Asia-Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. So this forum, the Asia-Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development, happens every year. So all countries, all of your countries from this region will come for this forum, and there are usually actually youth forums that take place just before or coinciding with this Forum for Sustainable Development. So I think you can keep this in mind for next year. It happens usually around March. And then this is an opportunity to actually, where the countries make some statements on the progress. There are some, for example, there will be some Sustainable Development Goals that will be reviewed each year, but actually next year, I think there is a discussion of the member states asking not to separate the goals, but actually to review all the 17 goals, because previously it used to be only 3 goals or 4 goals or 5 goals. So then for the Asia-Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development Goals, the Regional Commission, which is called Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, that is housed here in Bangkok, and we actually are sitting just in the building next to it. I'm looking at the building, and this is the compound. They will prepare the regional SDG progress report, where they will make their assessment of what is happening on the SDGs in the region. And it's actually a good resource material for many of you, and I'm sure maybe some of you even have already looked at the SDG progress reports, national one or the regional one that is there, to actually find out what is happening in my country with regards to each of the goals. If not, at the end of my presentations, I have some links for you to take a look. Then every year, at least for the maybe 3 years from Nadine, correct me if I'm wrong, there will be a thematic report that will also be dedicated to a specific topic that will be presented at the forum. And this year, because the topic of the forum and the topic of the high-level political forum was on inclusion, inclusion and equality, so also the thematic report was on inclusion and equality. And Nadine, in your guidebook, there is a link. I saw that you could, Nadine has provided the link for this report for you guys to see, where actually a lot of the focus that that was done by the team of ESCAP, ADB and UNDP has been put to say about the importance of civic engagement, or you know, activism or volunteerism to achieve the sustainable development goals, especially the inclusion or the equality, or when we talk about leaving no one behind. Because if you can't partner, if the governments cannot work alongside with the communities, with the community organizations or volunteer groups at the local level, then we will probably be lagging behind on a lot of the sustainable development goals. And then, so what will happen after the Asia Pacific Forum is the countries that are doing all the countries will actually go to the high-level political forum on sustainable development, and this will take place in New York. Usually takes place in July. This is where the countries will prepare their full-fledged report on the progress of SDGs. So you will see 47 countries presented the Voluntary National Review reports in 2018. In 2019, it was 51 countries. So slightly more, and as well, there will be some global reports that that will be prepared. So I think this is just for you. I will not repeat, because I think I already spoke about this on what each of the processes actually entails. From the Asia Pacific Forum to the high-level political forum in terms of the follow-up and review of the SDGs. So I think it's good for you to keep and refer as an information. These are some guiding principles. And a very important principle that the countries will follow when they do the voluntary national reviews is to actually really engage different stakeholders. And this is where a lot of the communities and volunteers and volunteer groups will get involved. We had some countries, I will show you, but we had in Sri Lanka, for example, actually through volunteers, some of the data was collected on the SDGs, and the government has actually referred to volunteers as one of the initial steps when they just embarked on the process of the voluntary national review. I think Sri Lanka did it, last year they did a voluntary national review report. So this year I already spoke about the theme of the high-level political forum and the Asia Pacific Forum. So empowering people and ensuring inclusiveness and equality. What it means is that there were 6 of the SDGs, as you would see, 4, 8, 10, 13, 16, and 17 that were under review. So a lot of the focus went in that. And you will see some of the countries in this region, you come from some of these countries yourselves, that did the voluntary national review. And it would be, I don't know, perhaps if I was with you guys in the audience, I would ask some of you if you knew your country is doing the voluntary national review report, or if you were somehow involved. So feel free to message in the group if you were involved, and I think it would be good for those of you who were involved. And you see some of the previous themes that were there. So for next year is actually, as I mentioned, there will be a holistic or review about all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but the theme actually for next year has not been decided yet, and will be decided in September. So I think this is something important for you to keep in mind and to follow on what will be the focus for next year, because it means that your countries will also have a focus, be it on acceleration or etc. So just to give you a few examples actually of how volunteers were engaged or involved in the voluntary national review processes. So in Mongolia this year, Mongolia was one of the countries that did the voluntary national review reports, and Mongolia did their a consultation meeting with volunteer organizations where they actually went through each of the 6 goals that were under review, and they did like a mapping exercise on which of the sustainable development goals actually their organization or their volunteers are working on to achieve. So then through a consultation meeting, they came up with a short report that was then presented to the National Planning Ministry, where, you know, for the ministry, it was actually quite an interesting reaction, because they really didn't know that a lot of this volunteer effort were actually done for the SDGs, and if not this consultation meeting, there's probably no way they would have found out, because the context of I think of the national planning ministries and committees is such that they will look at a lot of statistical data. They will look at, you know, a lot of large-scale national initiatives that are taking place in the country, whereas not so much attention would be put into how actually people, citizens, and volunteers are involved in the sustainable development goals. So this is one example. Another example is Cambodia is another country that did their voluntary national review. And Cambodia, in this year, we also had a number of volunteers that was involved in the process of the voluntary national review in different consultations that took place. And in the final report, Cambodia has actually made numerous references to volunteering. So you will see on the slide, for example, it was related to some of the pilot programs, volunteering during community services or school holidays. So volunteering was seen as important for education. The group of volunteer lawyers were also put here as another example. So, and volunteerism is seen for, as recognized by young people. So we do try to really work with a lot of the countries, and we try to support volunteer groups to actually be involved in such processes, because it's important for countries to actually engage the citizens. When you think of it, it's not about the word of volunteerism that is in the report, but it is actually about how the citizens of a certain country are actually involved in the development of the countries that is happening. And this is what is the essence of volunteerism. So I think this is for you to also keep in mind that if your country, I think next year, if we have someone from Bangladesh, next year Bangladesh will be doing a voluntary national review. So this is something for you to keep in mind. I know that India will be doing their voluntary national review next year. I can't remember right now other countries, but even if your countries are not doing this, if you should be aware and try to get involved in the national development processes, or at least don't be shy to let the local officials or the state officials know that you are actually doing a significant work in the community or with a certain group. Also, I mean, another area that that is quite, there are a lot of similar sort of gray areas between volunteerism and social entrepreneurship or youth entrepreneurship in this region from what I see. That's why I included a few slides, and my colleagues included a few slides from the recent report that was done. This is another sort of trend where now we see that volunteers are becoming social entrepreneurs, or trying to somehow put their ideas that are for social good, but also have some entrepreneurial aspect to it. So this is just to say that this is what is happening in the country, and this is important for the socio-economic growth of the region. And I mean, maybe some of the initiatives that you are doing is actually falls under this category. I did have an interesting chat with some groups of young people in the countries where they will tell me that they are volunteerpreneurs, which is a very interesting new concept for me. And we are trying to see how we can leverage or explore this more as a trend in the region, because young people identify themselves as volunteerpreneurs. So it is sort of a blended topic that I cannot, a blended definition that I cannot yet define. But this is just to show that there is a lot of, in terms of entrepreneurship education, there are still a lot of gaps, but in the region there is an ecosystem for social entrepreneurship, and I think UNDP is one of the strong players right now with a group of private sector that is working to support young people in entrepreneurship, and actually trying to link their entrepreneurial ideas to the principle of leaving no one behind. So trying to really, or trying to support the ideas of young people with disabilities in their entrepreneurship journey. So I provided this as another sort of idea for you guys, perhaps to also think of a social issue, you know, or an SDG, but from the entrepreneurship angle, or when you partner, or when you look for partners, also look for young social entrepreneurs, perhaps. Another example that is linked to social entrepreneurship is we did run the Youth Volunteering Innovation Challenge last year, which was for ASEAN countries as well. And these are the 3 countries that you see. 2 are from Indonesia, 1 from Philippines, where we really worked, well, these teams were selected because they had a strong volunteer engagement. So their idea was actually very much focused, or would not exist, let's say this way, without the active engagement of volunteers. For example, the Eco Fund, which is a board game in Indonesia, is made of recycled materials. They do give this as an income to produce this game to the women from the communities, to the poor communities. But then they also have a large number of volunteers who will raise awareness about this game and will promote this game among young people and among school children. So they do exist thanks to a lot of the volunteer groups and volunteer members. So the other one is from the Philippines. They work with urban communities, but trying to actually make the link between, you know, the local products and the larger market. And the Tune Map, which is an app in Indonesia that is also with the support of volunteers, are actually mapping how accessible the roads or the certain pavements are for people that have physical disabilities. So without volunteers, actually they would not be able to do this application. Okay, so this story, last time I mentioned, Fatima and Anisa are the two girls. They are the UN volunteers in Pakistan with the project of UNDP that are doing awareness raising on the elections and on the civic rights. I will not repeat the story, but I included here the link. So in case you are interested to read the full story, or you could browse on our website and read or get inspired by other stories as well. I know that a lot of you have been mobilized through the online volunteering platform that UNV also administers. It's a platform that we've been creating actually for 15 years or more now, maybe 17 now, and we get a lot of feedback on it that it's very good and etc. But just to put in a perspective, it took so many years to to create something like this. So why I'm talking about this now is also because if you are looking to improve some of your skills, or if you are looking at volunteering and connecting, so you could do that through the platform and with any other organization in any part of the world. So you could, if you have a bit of a spare time, or if you know people who are really want to volunteer from their computer, this is sort of a platform to go to. And I think I did put a few of the useful resources for you. So UN ESCAP, the Regional Commission, has the Youth Policy Toolbox. So this is a resource for young people, for governments, for youth organizations on everything related to when it comes to youth and youth policies. So please take time to also sort of dig and explore what is out there. Perhaps it can be helpful in maybe establishing networks or getting to know the youth sort of environment or toolkits as well there. Also, there is, we have the Asia Pacific Interagency Network on Youth, which is a network that is consisting of the UN organizations like UNDP and UNV and many more others, UNICEF, etc. We have a website where we try to put updates and things, and we do get young people to write to us sometimes and questions, and we put resources there. So I think also feel free to refer to that. On the Sustainable Development Goals, another resource that I would like to put in front of you is the help desk of the SDG help desk of the ESCAP, of the Regional Commission. It's very, very useful because it has tons and tons of resources. It has online courses that are free that you could, if you want to dig and find out more on gender, you could take a course from there. You have some technical guidance on different aspects. If you are looking into integrate environmental aspects in your organization or in your initiatives, you can also find. If you can actually interact in the community of practice part. You could interact with some organizations, or you could actually talk about what you are doing for a certain SDG or SDGs there, and etc. So it's a wealth of information, including data and everything, and you are free to use it in your initiatives. And I think that's it from my side. Thank you. I would be pleased to take questions or comments or reactions.
Thank you so much, Emilia, for this brilliant presentation. I'm sure everyone has to take a deep breath with all the information you shared. It was an amazing overview. So not that I want to summarize it, but really giving some insights about the challenges related to volunteering and volunteerism, related to management, retention, recognition. You talked a lot about the measurement issue and the tools and the mechanism available with other UN organizations, ILO, and so on, related to the qualitative and the quantitative measurement of volunteering. Very much a lot of information about the importance of alliance building, how we need to create networks of peers to share knowledge, to share communities, to share the networks as well. The importance of community involvement and leaving no one behind. So really including persons with disability, refugees and other members of vulnerable and minorities in the work that we're doing. A lot of information also about the reporting, the monitoring processes related to SDGs in this region, about the VNRs, the HRPF, the APFSD, all these acronyms that she mentioned. You can go back to the slides and understand. But basically really this kind of connection between the grassroots local work that is done by volunteers worldwide and very much in this region, connecting it to the national development plans, connecting it to the regional processes, and connecting it to the global processes. So really, thank you so much for this very, very detailed presentation. It was wonderful. And if there are no more questions, we're going to give it another minute. It would be great if Jessica, Sanki, and Suki can work together to compile all the resources and the publications you mentioned and post it in the Facebook groups. And over to you, advocates. If you have any questions, please shoot. You have Emilia for another few minutes. So take advantage of this expert. Really was such a great presentation.
Okay, is there any, okay, there's a question I see from Bikash. Is there any data on volunteers from Nepal, the updated ones? Also, I want to know how many volunteers are working from Nepal so that I can connect with them. Okay, so I do have the information on the data of on volunteers from Nepal. Because we, earlier this year, we did ask the governments from this region, including Nepal, to submit what we call the National Situation Analysis on Volunteerism, where it's sort of a review of what is happening in the area of volunteerism in the country. So Nepal has submitted their report. And I don't remember it from my head on the data of volunteers from Nepal, but I'll be happy to send you. Maybe Jessica and Sanki can take a note of this, and I could include this for you. But there is this information, and moreover, I can tell you that the Ministry of Youth from Nepal is very interested to work on the policy. Volunteerism policy in Nepal, and it is quite important from our point of view because it can help the enabling environment or the volunteers that are there in Nepal. So I would also be happy if you want to connect with other volunteers, from what I understand, to connect you with our colleague in Nepal. She is representing UNV in Nepal, so she would be, I'm sure she would be also happy to connect with you. So just take a note that we have to. Yeah.
We actually have an advocate based in Nepal who's working for VSO, which is a leading worldwide organization working on volunteering. So I don't think she left the training. She put a note on the Facebook group, but she must have the latest information about volunteering in Nepal. Yeah. So ideally, she would post a question on the Facebook group, and hopefully she will answer. And then our colleagues can also add some resources on the Facebook group, so everyone can benefit from it.
Okay. If possible, okay, from Asad Mustafa, if possible, can you elaborate on volunteerpreneurs? Seems like an interesting concept. What kind of work they have done in the past? Okay, thank you, Asad, for this question. But I would love to actually explore this concept as well, and we have started to talk with UNDP. We would like to actually find more groups like this. So this interaction that I mentioned was with a group from Singapore, where of volunteerpreneurs. So when the definition that they sort of provided in the unofficial discussion that I had with them was that they are a volunteer group that is having that is based on a large number of volunteers that is doing a social good. You know, they are doing a lot of in public areas or in parks. They are doing activities to engage citizens on different environmental mainly issues, but they're also trying to make some kind of profit through the through the advertisements that they get from some private sector and etc. from some companies while they do this sort of public sort of flash mobs or activities. So this is like their definition. Again, I'm not claiming that this is the right definition, but this is something yet to explore. And yeah, so I think I'll be happy to explore if there's anyone interested. I can see, okay, Robin, I can see that Bangladesh government has prepared a progress report on SDGs in 2018. How would I know whether this is the VNR you were referring to? I think I don't know if we can look right now because do you know, Nadine, do you remember if it's a progress report or is it the Voluntary National Review report?
I can check on the website, but I think it's a progress report.
Oh, it's a progress report. So Bangladesh next year will be doing their Voluntary National Review report. So I think the difference between the progress report versus the Voluntary National Review is that in Voluntary National Review there are strict guidelines that the countries have to follow. There is a whole guidebook on that, and it's a more holistic sort of review of the SDGs, whereas the progress report on SDGs that the country is making is actually based on, the country will set their own parameters of what they want to review. Maybe it's just a review sort of on the overall picture on the progress, or with the focus on some of the SDGs. Nadine, were you able to check?
No, I couldn't find the link, unfortunately. We can look, add it to the
We'll
list.
take a note of this as well, the Bangladesh, yeah.
I think Sunita actually from Nepal is here with us right now. So I don't know if Sunita, if your microphone is working, maybe you can give us a bit of information about volunteerism in Nepal. We can unmute yourself, or we can unmute you. And I think after that, we're gonna quickly wrap up because I think Emilia needs to go. So Sunita, if you are able to, or you can just write. Okay, well then Sunita, in this case, maybe write in the Facebook group so that everyone can get your information that you can share. And unless there's a very burning question at this point, I think we're gonna wrap up. And thank our guest speaker, Emilia, again, very, very much for the time you took to prepare this presentation and the delivery, which was very good. Thank you to everyone in the room as well. Suki, Jessica, Sanki, Jarawat for helping us making this a success. A little hello to Gayan from the SDG Action Campaign, who's also online. And everyone, thank you for attending, and we'll be in touch in the Facebook group. Remember, there's going to be a webinar next week about the My World platforms with Gayan, so hopefully all of you can join. It will be in the evening Asia time, so it will be easier for a lot of you to join. Thank you again, everyone. Emilia, have a good one. Good evening,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, I stop the.
I think my voice is.
Yeah, your voice is. Haven't stopped. Stop meeting. End meeting. End meeting for.